Welcome back to News Talk. So, have you ever checked your mobile device in the middle of a face-to-face conversation with another person? You know, have you ever just kind of like pulled it out and gone like this, yeah, right, Almost everyone's done it. But when you think about it, it's not a very nice thing to do. Now, a scholar at Baylor has researched the ways in which technology is impacting our behavior. He's Dr. James Roberts, a professor of marketing, and he joins us now via Skype from Baylor's campus in Waco. And Professor, it's great to have you with us. This is a really good conversation, a really good topic for us to talk about. So thank you very much for your time today.
Oh, thank you for having me, and you're right. It is a topic that affects all of us.
It seems to some, and this will break down pretty significantly along age, in terms of what age group you belong to. But the notion for many that you would be talking with someone at coffee or wherever, and you would just kind of pull out your phone and do a little check, and then put the phone down and resume. For some, particularly younger people, folks who've grown up with technology, that will seem like no big deal. Explain why it is.
Well, you know, there's not as much of an age divide as you might think. Younger people, we're finding out, just like older people, are offended and do have their feelings hurt, when their phone conversation or when their face-to-face conversations are interrupted by someone picking up their phone, or by when someone's just in the same room using their phone rather than conversing with them. So it's really not as much of a age divide as you might think. And so we've got a term for it, and I laugh because this term is, and the topic, like you mentioned, is so universal that everyone has an experience. Everyone has been fubbed. I can promise you that. And then a lot of us are fubbers as well. And what I mean.
So you call it fubbing, and this is the combination of two words, I assume?
Yeah, fubbing is the combination of the words phone snubbing.
Yep. So
if you've been fubbed, someone has either interrupted a conversation you were having with them to attend to their phone, or it may be that they ignore you altogether and talk on their phone while you're standing there left spinning your wheels.
At the center of this, it seems to me, and I want your take on this, but at the core of it, it seems, is the notion that something more important could be happening over here, or that, and this is really terrible, but that something more interesting could be going on with the phone, right? Is that it? I mean, is that what's at the nub of this?
Yeah, it's as simple as that. It's that, the grass is always greener, so we think that, the person on the phone or whatever's going on the phone is more important than the person sitting in front of you. And, of course, we're all human beings. We all know how that makes us feel, no matter whether you're 13 or 53 or 63 or 73. When someone's attending to somebody or to something else, when they're in your presence, that's telling you that's more important than you are, and that hurts all of us. We're all human beings. Our relationships with others is everything to us, and so when those relationships are threatened by that type of behavior, we're less happy for it.
To what extent does brain chemistry factor into our returning over and over, sometimes compulsively? You could almost argue or observe it could feel like an addiction. This may not be 100% your area of expertise, but we do know that there is something kind of within us that it's like a reward center stimulation, right? That registers when we're reconnecting with our lovely devices.
Oh, 100%. And this is very much up my alley here. This is very much in my bailiwick. I have a book that I've just written called Too Much of a Good Thing. Are You Addicted to Your Smartphone? So that's a book that I've written that talks about not only fubbing, but chapter 2 talks about that very subject of addiction. Can we be addicted to behavior? Can we be addicted to our smartphones? And the resounding answer is yes, we can be. We get pleasure. Anything that can produce pleasure in our brain, dopamine, epinephrine, serotonin, those are things that give us pleasure. Those types of behaviors, whether they're substances or behaviors like smartphone use, can lead to addiction.
Conversations like this one might alert people to their own issue in this area, to the extent that that's true for me or anyone listening at home now. What's your advice?
Yeah, very good. What your advice is, you really got to do some self-monitoring. I think that's the most important. You need to be aware about your smartphone use. And so here are some tidbits or some tips that I would share with your listeners, viewers, about how they can see if they have a problem. When we're looking at addictions. Now, whether this is a substance addiction, drugs or alcohol, or a behavioral addiction, we look for the same signs. And things that we would look for is your use of this particular device or substance. We'll stick with devices today. Mm-hmm. Is it increasing? Has it become deeply ingrained in your life? Is it the last thing you look at when you go to sleep? Maybe you even sleep with it. It's the first thing that you look at. You maybe use it as an alarm clock, and the first thing you check before you get out of bed. You drive with it in the car. You interrupt your conversations with others. Well, that might be a suggestion that smartphones have kind of got their claws too deep into you. But other things you want to look at is, have you tried to cut back and failed? That's a clear sign that you may be addicted, or if we don't use the word addicted, overly attached, obsessed, compulsive about our smartphone use. I'm not really so caught up on that word addiction because I think it has a lot of emotional baggage tied to it. But if you've tried to quit, tried to cut back, not quit, because I think smartphones have a lot of very valuable uses, as we all can understand, but if you tried to cut back and you failed, that's a pretty sure sign that you're overly attached, if not addicted, to your smartphone. And then I think the real acid test is your use increasing? Yes. Have you tried to quit and failed? Yes. Then the next thing I'd look at, has there been any kind of conflict created by your smartphone? And that conflict could be very serious things like driving in your car, near accidents, or maybe even accidents. We know that the best estimates we have is that about 6,000 people have died last year alone based upon cell phone-related accidents in the car. And we know that the damage to cars on non-fatal accidents run over $9 billion. So there's a lot going on. So have you had an accident? Has there been some kind of problem with your car use? Or conflict can just be, have you had fights with your parents? Or if you're married, have you had fights with your spouse? You bet. Our last paper talked about just that. It talked about how this phubbing behavior, giving priority to our smartphones over our spouses, leads to lower levels of relationship satisfaction, which is, of course, disastrous.
Indeed it is. Let me ask you this, though, and this is based on observation in many, many different social settings. If you look at, I remember being at dinner recently, and two women were having a meal, and they were both on their phones on and off throughout the course of the evening, sometimes separately, often it was together. I've seen groups of 5 or 6 people, maybe a family or some other gathering, young people perhaps, and they're all on and off the phone all the time. If it's close to universal, is it rude, or are we redefining what it means to be together?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think, with like any new technology, we're kind of learning what's acceptable, what's unacceptable. It's kind of fluid, and it changes from person to person, but it's not really the new reality. Because what our research is telling us is that people's feelings are hurt and relationships are undermined when people give priority to their smartphones over their relationships. So yeah, no, it really does bother us. And so it is not something where what I liked, there's a term that was used in a book written about this, about people being using the cell phones, both on the phones or an iPad when they're all together. It's a book by the name of Sherry Turkle called Alone Together.
Reminds me of the book Bowling for One. I never thought anyone would bowl alone, but the times they are indeed changing. There was a report on CNN just in the last few hours. It was a survey, and they found that the average 13-year-old checks his or her device, their social media and what have you, on an average of 100 times a day. Should teens be attempting, and I know this gets us into a kind of a funny, maybe an unlikely area, but should teens be thinking about their connection, their overly intense connection to their devices, addiction, if you want to call it that, and what advice would you have for parents?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think, having been the parent of 2 teenage daughters, I don't think we can leave it up to the teenagers themselves to self-medicate or to, cut back on their smartphone use. I think that is something that comes from the parents. And there's a number of things that parents can do. One course, and one thing that I particularly like, advice I give, I call it the hair of the dog. And what I mean by that is there are a number of apps that parents can use or people can use on their own phones that limits the amount of time that others or themselves spend on their smartphones. One of the apps for the iOS system for the Apple phones is called Moments, and you can set limits on different activities on the phone, and in that way, you know, trying to almost force upon either yourself or your children some kind of limits to how they use the smartphones. I think that's a real good, you know, kind of parental control apps, if you want to call them that. But they're not just for parents with children, but they can also be, we can use them ourselves to help us be more healthy in how we use our smartphones.
We have about 30 seconds left. Can you give us one other nugget from your book, and we are a little pressed on the clock? One other takeaway or something that you delve into just briefly?
Yes. If you want to get buy-in from your children or your spouse as it relates to appropriate smartphone use, write a contract. We call these things social contracts. Get down in writing what's acceptable behavior, what's unacceptable behavior, and what's the punishments for breaking the contract. I think having it in writing and having mutual agreement on it increases people's buy-in.
Professor James Roberts teaches at Baylor University. He's the author of Too Much of a Good Thing, joining us via Skype from Waco. Thank you, Professor, for your time. I would love to chat with you about this again. It's such a really interesting topic. Thanks again for your time.
Nice to meet you.
Back with more in a moment.